The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the city of New York in hues of amber and crimson. Towering above the skyline, the Zenith Tower, a sleek glass and steel masterpiece, stood as a symbol of wealth and influence. With its 60 stories glinting in the twilight, the building housed some of the city's most powerful figures, including its owner, William Harrington. At 40, William was the epitome of discipline and success, a man whose sharp suits and sharper gaze spoke of unrelenting ambition. His jet-black hair was always perfectly in place, and his striking blue eyes seemed to pierce through every obstacle in his path. From his penthouse office, William observed the sprawling city below. The skyline gleamed with lights, yet his mind was shadowed by a letter sitting unopened on his polished mahogany desk. The envelope bore the crest of his late grandfather, Charles Harrington, a titan of industry and the man who had built the empire William now controlled. The old man's influence still loomed large over his grandson's life, even in death. With a deep breath, William broke the seal on the envelope. Inside, the handwritten words seemed to leap off the page. To inherit the full estate and preserve the Harrington legacy, you must be married, not in name alone, but in true love, before the 75th anniversary of the Harrington Corporation. If this condition is not met, the entirety of the estate will be donated to charity. The weight of the letter struck him like a freight train. The deadline was just a week away, and finding a genuine connection in such a short time was a near impossible task. For William, relationships had always been strategic alliances, calculated for mutual benefit. The concept of love seemed foreign, a vulnerability he had always avoided. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the Manhattan skyline. His meticulously curated life, a fortress of achievement and control, now seemed on the verge of collapse. Yet, amidst the tension, a plan began to take shape. If love was the requirement, then a convincing performance might suffice. It wasn't ideal, but William wasn't one to lose. William folded the letter carefully, placing it back on his desk. His jaw tightened as the reality sank in. He needed a solution, and fast. As he stood and paced his office, the city's hum seemed to amplify his restless thoughts. His eyes fell on a framed photo of his grandfather, a man of uncompromising values, who had built the Harrington Empire with integrity and vision. William's respect for him was immense, yet this condition felt like an uncharacteristic gamble, a final test he hadn't prepared for. The evening's charity gala, an annual event hosted by the Harrington Foundation, offered a potential opportunity. The guest list boasted a who's who of New York's elite, alongside advocates and activists passionate about their causes. Among them, he hoped to find someone who could play the role he desperately needed. By the time William arrived at the grand venue, the Metropolitan Art Museum, the event was in full swing. The building's neoclassical facade gleamed under the soft glow of the surrounding lights. Inside, chandeliers cast a golden glow over the crowd, and the air buzzed with conversations punctuated by the clink of champagne glasses. He moved through the throng with purpose, offering polite nods and curt greetings while scanning the room. It was during a speech advocating for underfunded community projects that his attention was caught. Standing at the podium was a woman whose presence seemed to command the room. Dressed in a simple yet elegant black dress, her voice resonated with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "We're not just fighting for a building," she said, her tone passionate. "We're fighting for the soul of a neighborhood, for the people who call it home, and for the hope it represents. The East End Community Center has been a lifeline for so many families, and we cannot let it be destroyed." William found himself captivated, not just by her words, but by the fire in her eyes. She was unlike anyone else in the room, radiating sincerity in a sea of calculated pleasantries. After polite applause followed her speech, she stepped down from the stage, looking slightly disheartened by the lack of pledges. He decided to approach her. "Excuse me," he said, extending a hand. "I'm William Harrington. I was impressed by your speech." She turned, surprised by the introduction. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I'm Margaret Daniel," she replied, shaking his hand firmly, though it seems passion alone doesn't loosen wallets. Her honesty caught him off guard. "Sometimes persistence is what makes the difference," he said, offering a faint smile. "I'd like to learn more about your cause, if you have a moment." Margaret hesitated, her gaze searching his for sincerity. "The East End Community Center means everything to me," she said finally. "I grew up there, learned to read there, and now I volunteer to ensure others have the same opportunities I did. But the developers don't care about that. They see a prime spot for luxury condos." Her words struck a chord William didn't expect. For all his wealth, he had never experienced that kind of connection to a place or community. He cleared his throat, steering the conversation toward his proposal. "Margaret, I might have a way to help save the center, but it would require your help as well." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued but wary. "What kind of help?" "I need a wife. Temporarily, of course," he said, watching her expression shift from confusion to disbelief. "Before you say no, hear me out. If we agree to a mutually beneficial arrangement, I can guarantee the preservation of the center. In return, you'd need to pose as my wife for a brief period, just 1 week." Margaret blinked, then let out a short laugh. "You're serious?" "Completely," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm offering a partnership. Nothing more, nothing less. Once the week is over, we can go our separate ways, and the center will be secure." She studied him for a long moment, her instincts warning her against trusting a man whose world was so far removed from hers. Yet the thought of saving the center, the faces of the children who depended on it, outweighed her reservations. "All right," she said, her voice steady, "but let's be clear. This is strictly business." William nodded. "Strictly business." The following morning, Margaret found herself standing in front of the grand Harrington estate, her modest suitcase in hand. The mansion was nothing short of breathtaking. Set on sprawling grounds in an exclusive neighborhood outside Manhattan, the estate combined classical elegance with modern opulence. Towering marble columns framed the entrance, and manicured gardens stretched as far as the eye could see. As she stepped onto the cobblestone driveway, the massive double doors opened, revealing William. He was impeccably dressed, as usual, his presence commanding, yet somehow restrained. He descended the steps with a measured pace, nodding to the staff that emerged to carry her luggage inside. "Welcome, Margaret," he said, his voice formal but not unfriendly. "I trust the car service was comfortable?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, adjusting her grip on her bag. Her nerves prickled, but she squared her shoulders, determined not to show it. "Let me show you around," William said, gesturing for her to follow him inside. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than its exterior. High ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over polished floors and priceless art. Margaret couldn't help but glance around, her footsteps echoing softly as they moved through the grand foyer. Despite her best efforts to remain composed, she felt out of place in such an extravagant setting. "You'll be staying in one of the guest suites," William explained as they climbed the sweeping staircase. "You'll have privacy, but we'll need to appear as a genuine couple when in public or around my family." Margaret nodded, absorbing the weight of her new role. "And your family, do they know about this arrangement?" "Not yet," he admitted, pausing at the top of the stairs. "My grandfather is the only one who needs convincing. For him, appearances are everything. If he believes the marriage is genuine, we'll both get what we want." "Understood," she said, though the thought of deceiving an elderly man made her stomach twist. They reached a lavish suite where William gestured toward the door. "This will be your room. If you need anything, the staff is at your disposal." Margaret stepped inside, her breath catching at the sight of the elegant space. A 4-poster bed draped in soft linen stood at the center, flanked by antique furnishings. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the gardens below. "This is more than I expected," she admitted, setting her bag down by the door. William inclined his head. "We aim for comfort here." Before she could respond, a voice called from the hallway. "William, is that her?" Margaret turned to see an elderly man in a wheelchair being pushed by a caregiver. Despite his frail frame, his sharp eyes sparkled with curiosity and warmth. "Grandfather," William said, stepping forward, "this is Margaret Daniels, my fiancée." Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she approached the older man. His kind smile put her somewhat at ease, and she extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Harrington," she said. "Charles, please," he replied, clasping her hand with surprising strength. "And the pleasure is all mine. I must say, William didn't do you justice when he spoke of you. You're lovely." Margaret couldn't help but smile at the compliment. "Thank you. I've heard so much about you as well. Your work with the Harrington Foundation is truly inspiring." Charles chuckled, his gaze flicking to William. "She's charming too. You've done well, my boy." William's expression softened briefly, though he quickly regained his composure. "Margaret and I share similar values. I'm confident we'll build something meaningful together." Charles nodded approvingly before turning his attention back to Margaret. "I'm looking forward to getting to know you better, my dear. It's clear you've brought something special into my grandson's life." Margaret felt a pang of guilt at his sincerity, but managed to keep her composure. "I'll do my best to make you proud." Later that evening, Margaret found herself alone in her suite, staring out at the moonlit gardens. The day had been overwhelming, filled with introductions and subtle reminders of the world she was now navigating. As she ran her fingers over the smooth fabric of the gown laid out for the upcoming dinner party, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head. The evening of the dinner party arrived, and Margaret stood in front of the ornate mirror in her suite, smoothing down the elegant navy gown William's staff had provided. The dress was a masterpiece, hugging her figure in all the right places and accentuating her natural beauty without being ostentatious. A pair of sparkling earrings completed the look, and as she examined herself, she barely recognized the woman staring back. A soft knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, William stood waiting, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo. His expression, usually so composed, shifted slightly as he took her in. "You look stunning," he said, his tone uncharacteristically sincere. Margaret felt a warmth rise to her cheeks but quickly dismissed it. "Thank you. You don't look too bad yourself." He offered a rare smile and extended his arm. "Shall we?" They descended the grand staircase together, their entrance timed perfectly to catch the attention of the gathered guests. The Harrington Estates dining room was a marvel of opulence, with a long gleaming table set beneath a chandelier that cast shimmering light over the scene. Guests murmured in appreciation as William and Margaret entered, their polished appearances cementing the illusion of a perfect couple. Throughout the dinner, Margaret played her role flawlessly, engaging in polite conversation and deflecting probing questions about their relationship with well-crafted anecdotes. William, seated beside her, matched her efforts, seamlessly weaving their fabricated love story into the dialogue. At one point, Charles raised a glass, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation. "I'd like to propose a toast to my grandson William and his wonderful fiancée Margaret. It warms my heart to see this union, and I know their future together will honor the Harrington name." The room erupted in applause, but Margaret's chest tightened. The guilt of deceiving Charles weighed heavily on her, but she forced a smile and lifted her glass. William glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but a flicker of something softer lingered in his gaze. After dinner, as the guests mingled over drinks, Margaret slipped out onto the terrace for a moment of solitude. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling formality of the evening. She leaned against the balustrade, staring out at the sprawling gardens below, her mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. "I thought I might find you out here," came William's voice behind her. She turned, surprised. "Needed a break from the adoring crowd?" "Something like that," he replied, stepping beside her. He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You handled yourself well tonight. My grandfather is thoroughly convinced." Margaret nodded, her tone quieter. "He's a good man. I hate lying to him." William's jaw tightened. "You're not alone in that. This wasn't how I envisioned things, but we don't have much choice." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "What about you? You're putting on a show, too. Does any of this," she gestured vaguely toward the house, "feel as hollow to you as it does to me?" For a moment William didn't answer. The distant sound of laughter drifted from inside, mingling with the rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Finally he said, "Sometimes. But for me, it's about duty. I've always done what's necessary to protect my family's legacy." "And love?" "Where does that fit into your life?" she asked, unable to hide her curiosity. He hesitated, his usual defenses faltering. "It doesn't. At least it hasn't." Margaret turned back to the view, her thoughts churning. "I guess we're not so different then. I'm here because of duty, too, to the center, to the community. I just hope we're not sacrificing too much of ourselves in the process." William studied her profile, her honesty striking a chord he hadn't expected. "I don't think you're the kind of person who sacrifices herself. You're too real." Margaret glanced at him, her expression softening. "And you?" "Who's the real William Harrington?" He opened his mouth as if to answer, but before he could speak, one of the staff appeared in the doorway, calling them back inside. The moment was broken, and William straightened, his professional demeanor snapping back into place. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his arm once again. Margaret hesitated briefly, then nodded, slipping her arm through his. As they returned to the glittering world of the Harrington estate, the air between them felt subtly changed, as if the carefully constructed walls of their arrangement had begun to crack. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity as the preparations for the wedding progressed. Margaret and William navigated their shared responsibilities with a blend of professionalism and growing familiarity. Though their arrangement was meant to be purely transactional, the time spent together, reviewing guest lists, discussing floral arrangements, and making decisions about the ceremony, unintentionally began to bridge the gap between them. One afternoon, William insisted on accompanying Margaret to visit the East End Community Center. As they drove through the bustling streets of Brooklyn, a sense of anticipation settled over them. Margaret was eager to show him the place that had shaped her, while William, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, felt compelled to see it for himself. When they arrived, the center's modest exterior stood in stark contrast to the grand buildings William was accustomed to. The peeling paint and weathered bricks told a story of resilience, not neglect, and the sound of children's laughter spilled out through the open windows. Margaret's face lit up as she stepped out of the car, her genuine affection for the place evident. Inside, the atmosphere was lively and welcoming. Children played in one corner while volunteers organized supplies in another. Margaret greeted several familiar faces, introducing William with a mix of pride and formality. To his surprise, he found himself charmed by the warmth of the community and the palpable sense of purpose that filled the space. "This is where it all started for me," Margaret said, as she showed him around. "I learned so much here, about myself, about the world. It's not just a building, it's a lifeline for so many people." William nodded, his usual polished demeanor softened. "I can see that. It's impressive. Not in a flashy way, but in how much it clearly means to everyone here." Margaret studied him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from someone like you." "Someone like me?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You know," she said with a wry smile, "the corporate titan who lives in a mansion and probably has his meals served on gold plates." He chuckled, a sound that startled both of them with its rarity. "I assure you the plates are only gold-plated." Her laughter joined his, and for a moment the barriers between their worlds seemed to dissolve. As they prepared to leave, a group of children ran up to Margaret, tugging at her hand and pleading for her to stay longer. She crouched down to their level, promising to return soon and bring books for the reading corner. William watched the interaction from a few steps away, something inside him stirring at the sight of her easy rapport with the children. On the drive back, the mood in the car was quieter, more contemplative. Margaret glanced at William, her curiosity piqued. "What did you think?" He hesitated, then said, "I think it's remarkable how much impact one place can have. I've spent my life focused on building empires, but what you've built here, it feels more meaningful." Margaret blinked, caught off guard by his candor. "I didn't build it. I'm just trying to keep it alive." "Sometimes that's harder," he replied, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Preserving something that matters." Her heart tightened at the unexpected depth in his words. She had assumed William Harrington was all business, but moments like this hinted at layers she hadn't anticipated. Layers that intrigued her, despite her resolve to keep things strictly professional. When they reached the Harrington estate, the staff informed them that Charles wanted to see them. They found him in the sunroom, a space filled with lush greenery and bathed in natural light. He smiled warmly as they entered, gesturing for them to sit. "I hear the wedding plans are coming along nicely," Charles said, his eyes twinkling. "I hope you're not letting the stress get to you." Margaret smiled. "Not at all. Everything's been running smoothly, thanks to William's impeccable organization." Charles chuckled. "He's always been meticulous, too much so at times. But I'm glad to see you balancing each other out." William shifted in his seat, unaccustomed to such personal observations. "Margaret's been instrumental," he said, his tone measured. "She has a way of making things feel more grounded." Charles studied them for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "Marriage is a partnership, not just a performance. It's about bringing out the best in each other, and from what I can see, you're off to a good start." Margaret swallowed hard, guilt twisting in her chest. She forced a smile, hoping it would mask the turmoil she felt. "Thank you, Charles. That means a lot." As they left the sunroom, Margaret's mind raced. The more time she spent with Charles and with William, the harder it became to separate reality from the facade they were creating. Her heart ached at the thought of disappointing Charles, whose faith in their union seemed so genuine. In the days leading up to the wedding, the connection between Margaret and William continued to deepen in subtle, unexpected ways. Their conversations grew less guarded, their laughter more frequent. Yet both remained acutely aware of the clock ticking down to the ceremony and the unspoken question of what would happen when the arrangement ended. The morning of the wedding dawned with a soft, golden light that streamed through the windows of the Harrington estate. Margaret stood in her suite, gazing out at the lush gardens below, where workers were putting the final touches on the ceremony space. Rows of white chairs lined the aisle, leading to an ornate floral arch overlooking the estate's private lake. It was breathtakingly beautiful, like something out of a dream, yet Margaret's heart was a storm of emotions. The gown she wore was exquisite, a fitted bodice of delicate lace that cascaded into a flowing skirt. The stylists had pinned her hair into a soft updo, leaving a few strands to frame her face, and her makeup was understated, enhancing her natural beauty. Despite her nerves, she looked every bit the radiant bride. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Lisa, her childhood best friend, who had insisted on being by Margaret's side during this surreal day. Lisa stepped inside, her expression a mix of awe and concern. "You look stunning," Lisa said, taking Margaret's hands, "but you also look like you're about to pass out. What's going on?" Margaret sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "This whole thing feels complicated. I know why I'm doing it, and I believe in the cause, but lying to Charles, pretending to be in love, it feels wrong." Lisa gave her a sympathetic smile. "You're doing what you have to do to save the center, and Charles clearly adores you. But what about William? Has he made things easier or harder?" Margaret hesitated, her cheeks warming as she thought about William. "He's been unexpected. At first I thought he was cold and calculated, but I've seen another side of him. He's thoughtful, even kind, in his own way. And sometimes I catch myself forgetting this is all just an arrangement." Lisa raised an eyebrow, a knowing smirk playing on her lips. "Sounds like someone might be catching feelings." Margaret shook her head quickly. "No, it's not like that. It can't be like that. This is temporary." Lisa squeezed her hands. "Just promise me one thing. Be honest with yourself. Whatever happens, don't let this arrangement stop you from feeling something real if it's there." Margaret nodded, though her thoughts remained tangled. After Lisa left, she turned back to the mirror, steeling herself for the day ahead. Meanwhile, in another part of the estate, William stood in his dressing room, adjusting his cufflinks with a precision that betrayed his nerves. His best friend and business partner David leaned casually against the doorframe, watching him with an amused expression. "You've faced down hostile takeovers with less tension," David teased. "What's got you so rattled?" William shot him a warning look but said nothing. After a moment he admitted, "This isn't just about the inheritance anymore. Margaret, she's different. She challenges me, makes me think about things I've avoided for years. It's unsettling." David folded his arms, his amusement fading. "And by things, you mean feelings?" William sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Feelings have never been part of the equation for me, but with Margaret, I don't know. She's real in a way I didn't expect, and I don't want to hurt her when this is over." David studied him, his expression serious. "Then maybe you need to figure out what you really want before you walk down that aisle. Because if this is just a business deal to you, you'll end up hurting both of you." William didn't respond, but David's words stayed with him as the final preparations were made for the ceremony. The wedding began as planned, with guests filling the garden and soft music drifting through the air. Margaret walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Charles's, who had insisted on escorting her despite his frailty. His smile radiated pride and joy, and Margaret felt a pang of guilt that nearly brought tears to her eyes. When she reached the altar, William was waiting, his expression unreadable, but his gaze unwavering. As they stood together before the officiant, the gravity of the moment settled over them. The ceremony proceeded smoothly until the officiant spoke the words that made Margaret's heart stop. "If anyone here has reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace." A tense silence fell over the garden, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Margaret glanced at William, whose jaw tightened as if he were bracing himself. She thought the moment would pass, but then William stepped forward. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice steady, but filled with an emotion Margaret couldn't place. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Margaret's stomach dropped. She stared at him, her heart pounding. "Margaret," William said, turning to face her, "I need to be honest. When we started this, it was just an arrangement, a way to meet the terms of my grandfather's will. But somewhere along the way, everything changed. I found myself looking forward to every moment we spent together, admiring your passion, your kindness, and your strength." Margaret's breath caught, tears welling in her eyes as she listened. "I don't want this to be a lie," William continued, his voice softening. "I don't want it to end when the week is over. I want to try, truly try, to make this real, if you'll have me." The crowd was silent, all eyes on Margaret. Her heart raced as she searched William's face, seeing the vulnerability he had so carefully hidden until now. Finally she found her voice. "William, I didn't expect this, but I feel the same way. I don't want this to be just a contract anymore." The officiant smiled, sensing the sincerity of the moment. "Shall we continue?" William nodded, taking Margaret's hands in his. They exchanged vows, this time filled with genuine emotion, their gazes locked as if the world had fallen away. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was no performance. It was the beginning of something real. As the applause erupted around them, Margaret and William slowly pulled apart, their eyes meeting with a mixture of relief and wonder. The energy in the garden shifted, no longer focused on the spectacle of a grand wedding, but on the undeniable connection between the two standing at the altar. Even Charles, watching from his seat with misty eyes, seemed to sense the authenticity of the moment. The reception began with the same grandeur as the ceremony. The estate's sprawling ballroom was transformed into a wonderland of cascading floral arrangements, shimmering lights, and tables adorned with crystal and gold. Guests mingled, toasting the newlyweds and offering warm congratulations. But for Margaret and William, the noise of the room felt distant, drowned out by the reality of what had just transpired. As they moved through the crowd together, smiling and thanking their guests, there was a new ease between them. Their earlier hesitations and uncertainties seemed to have melted away, replaced by something unspoken but deeply felt. When the first dance was announced, William led Margaret onto the floor, the soft strains of a string quartet filling the air. He took her hand, his other resting gently at her waist, and they began to sway in perfect rhythm. "You're not a bad dancer," Margaret teased, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Don't sound so surprised," William replied, his own smile breaking through. "I'm a man of many talents." The playful exchange felt natural, almost effortless, and as they moved together, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. Margaret looked up at him, her heart full, and for the first time she allowed herself to fully embrace the possibility of this being real. "I meant what I said earlier," William said quietly, his gaze steady. "This isn't just a contract anymore. I want to see where this can go. With you." Margaret's breath caught, her chest tightening with emotion. "I want that too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Their dance ended with a soft murmur of applause, but neither seemed to notice. They lingered on the floor for a moment longer, their connection palpable. It was Charles who finally broke the spell, wheeling himself forward with a beaming smile. "May I cut in?" he asked, his voice full of warmth. "Of course," William said, stepping aside to allow his grandfather to take Margaret's hand. Charles chuckled as Margaret crouched slightly, holding his hands as they swayed in place. "You've made an old man very happy, my dear," he said, his tone heartfelt. "Seeing you two together, seeing William open up in ways I never thought possible, it's a blessing." Margaret blinked back tears, squeezing his hands gently. "Thank you, Charles. That means more than I can say." As the night progressed, the celebration continued with laughter, heartfelt speeches, and moments that felt genuinely joyful. But amidst the revelry, William and Margaret found themselves stealing quiet moments together, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Later, as the reception wound down and the guests began to leave, the newlyweds retreated to the terrace overlooking the estate's gardens. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the scene. Margaret leaned against the balustrade, the cool night air brushing against her skin. "It's been a day," she said with a soft laugh, glancing at William beside her. "It has," he agreed, his voice tinged with something deeper. "But for the first time in a long time I feel hopeful." Margaret turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Hopeful about what?" "About us," he admitted, meeting her gaze. "About what this could become if we let it." She searched his face, her heart fluttering at the sincerity in his eyes. "I think I'm hopeful too," she said softly. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the day giving way to a quiet peace. Then, as if by instinct, William reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. Margaret didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, letting the warmth of his touch ease the lingering doubts in her mind. The next morning, the new chapter of their lives truly began. William made good on his promise to secure the future of the East End Community Center, finalizing the purchase of the property and pledging continued support through the Harrington Foundation. Margaret, overwhelmed with gratitude, accompanied him to the signing, where the staff and families from the center greeted them with cheers and heartfelt thanks. Over the weeks that followed, William and Margaret navigated their new reality together. While their relationship had begun as a business arrangement, it grew into something neither of them had anticipated. They learned to trust each other, to rely on each other, and to embrace the vulnerabilities that had once kept them apart. Charles, true to his word, watched their journey with pride, savoring the knowledge that his final lesson had been understood. Love, in its truest form, was the greatest legacy of all. And so, what began as a partnership of necessity blossomed into a story of redemption, growth, and an unexpected but enduring love.